Thanks very much, and thanks to the ISS and the ACSF for seeing fit to invite me and stretch the bounds of credibility in terms of what constitutes young. So I very much do appreciate that. And what I want to do, today is not talk about a particular research project. I like to use these things as an excuse to play with ideas that I wouldn't otherwise necessarily have a chance to play with. So forgive me that if I wind up going a bit astray. So what I want to talk about today is some trajectory of thinking in terms of resource-dependent communities and the well-being of these communities. And I think some discussions that are becoming and are going to become even more extraordinarily relevant as we move forward with certain forms of development. So what I want to do is cover a few things. I want to talk about a little bit of history in terms of these shifts of conventional knowledge that we've had. We have known this is how it works, and that what we know has, I would say, shifted at least 2 or 3 times over the past 20 or 30 years. Specifically, I want to spend most of the time engaging a few critiques of this past work. I'm guilty of contributing to it, and talk about a future trajectory of work in this context. So, in terms of thinking about the relationship between rural and resource-dependent and sustainability or well-being, and I may use those terms a little bit interchangeably, and so forgive me for that. Sort of this traditional rural booster view, especially, actually not exclusively in the West, but this part of it is actually fairly global, is this idea that rural jobs are resource jobs. I mean, when we sort of think about like the dominant metaphor of what kinds of employment happens in rural places, we often go straight towards energy, mining, forestry, fisheries, agriculture, these types of jobs. And I actually have great fun with a couple of my classes in asking people to estimate, even within the US, the proportion of all employment that is within one of these industries. Guesses usually start at about 20 to 30% and range upwards from there. It's more like 2 to 3%. They're off by an order of magnitude. So even this dominant, so there's this dominant metaphor that rural jobs, even here in North America, are based on the extraction and processing of natural resources. Another element of this traditional booster view is that these are the good jobs. These are jobs that are higher paying, they're more stable, and from a community standpoint, there's a whole bunch of Staples linkages theory that basically says, look, it's going to lead to other forms of development. So even if we don't necessarily like what we're seeing in a given context, this will set the stage. It will provide a platform for additional development. And so there's been a bunch of work, and here I'm going to go North American for a little while, in terms of these indicators of well-being of these types of communities. There was a big spate of work in the 1970s with the rapid rise of energy boom towns that basically led to the field of social impact assessment for people who have engaged that. There was another, the question that came up of sort of, when sustainability came up. I don't know when it came up, but I sure know when it got popular, which is this little report in 1987 by some folks who had somebody named Brundtland. That was picked up. I was in Canada not long after that, and the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers picked that up and basically said, we need to understand the sustainability of these communities that are engaged in this. This area of inquiry, especially in the West, was really dominated by analysis of secondary data. Stuff that you can pull off the US Census, stuff that you can pull off StatsCan, county business patterns, et cetera, et cetera. And so this basically resulted in sort of the new common knowledge. Basically, smug academics, rural sociologists such as myself and others saying that these boosters have it all wrong. Basically, when you look at a lot of the data, we see really that there's many fewer jobs than we commonly think. Rural's not as resource dependent as we tend to think it is. We can also be much more critical, potentially, of poor outcomes of places that are resource dependent when we look at issues like poverty, unemployment, education, other sorts of measures of social pathology like crime, that this form of economic development doesn't necessarily provide good outcomes to the residents, nor do these linkages necessarily come, right? So this idea of if this is supposed to be sort of a bridge form of development, we would think that the differences between these places would maybe narrow over time, and instead what we actually find when we look at longitudinal data is they often become exacerbated over time. And so there's a great spate of quote-unquote uneven development type of theories, right? Where places that are resource dependent stay resource dependent, get more peripheral over time rather than these linkages. And so basically this has sort of resulted within, again, the rural sociological tradition, thinking about this idea of resource dependence being something that's in the past rather than the future. And so we read now a lot more, especially in the West, we read about amenity development, we read about problems of some rural places have in terms of coping with rapid growth and culture clash that are basically tied more towards sort of keeping these places rural as sort of one type of problem. Another type of problem being sort of what happens to these places that don't have public lands or a view of the mountains or happen to be near the core of a thriving metropolitan, on the outskirts of the core of a metropolitan area. And so we see issues like outmigration. And so this idea really being resource-dependent communities and this scholarship was sort of a thing of the past. A funny thing happened, though, in not just the past few years. It's been happening longer than just the past few years, but clearly we have seen an explosion and a new renewal of interest in terms of resource dependence. And a lot of this has been based on energy development. Awful lot has been based on shale gas. It certainly has not been limited to shale gas. We've got issues of bioenergy. We've got issues of wind. And basically we have a resurgence in interest and a resurgence in terms of intellectual energy being spent on this question. And it's not simply here in the Northeast where we hear about it. I don't know how many of you saw the New York Times blurb that was out not long ago. Here's some of the major shale gas plays. This was what was in the New York Times. This is rural North Dakota. All right, so this is an area that basically had been black. It's now giving off more light. I believe this is Minneapolis and this is Chicago. When you look sort of at the amount of light, the amount of energy that's given off by shale gas flaring, easy for me to say, we're seeing the idea that there's some interesting things happening in terms of rural America and resource dependence. So I think we're going to get to do this again. And what I am hoping is that, given that I got to do a little bit of it before, again, stretching the bounds of young, I want to raise some questions about how it is that we might do differently this time and engage from not necessarily mistakes, but building on what's been learned. And there's three explicit or implicit assumptions, I think, in this line of past work that I want to take on. One is this idea that dependence and sustainability really mean something, and that they really mean what's necessarily suggested by conventional indicators. I want to take on the assumption that dependence is automatically negative, and I want to take on the idea of diversification is sort of this automatic antidote to the ills of dependence. And here I'm going to I'm basically trained as a rural sociologist, and when you're trained as a rural sociologist, you do a lot of community. When you do community, you sort of slop over into regional economics. And so I'd like to have a slide in here. The subtitle is why I wish I'd taken more economic sociology in graduate school, but I didn't do that much, so I apologize for that. So I want to critique these assumptions one by one. First one being this idea, is there really any such thing as the sustainability of resource-dependent communities? And so I did a lot of work when I was still with the Canadian Forest Service up in Edmonton, Alberta. And basically the story is that when we talk about this relationship, when we talk about how our resource-dependent communities doing, the answer is it depends. And it depends on how it is we define our measures. It depends on the story that you're trying to tell. So a lot of the work that I've done find incredible variations in terms of a number of things. One, the sustainability indicator that you choose. So if you want to tell a story about how our resource-dependent community is doing, and you tell a story about energy-dependent communities and you use income, median family income as your indicator, they're doing pretty damn well. If you try to tell a story using a different indicator, if you try to tell a story about crime, social pathology, migration rates, the story changes dramatically. And so this idea of indicators of community well-being, there is a plethora of indicators that we can choose from. And so when we're talking about the relationship, we need to be specific in terms of what kinds of indicators of well-being or sustainability. It also depends a great deal on how it is that we define and measure dependence. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. I mean, typically what we do is measure it based on jobs, employment, or employment income. Another critique I have of this work is that we've had an awful lot of focus on average outcomes. So the relationship depends a lot. It varies by place. It varies by time period that you're engaging. And there is an awful lot of variability. So between places, between times, but also a lot of variability within context as well. And so a lot of what has to happen and happen better in terms of even when staying within this conventional analysis, need to think about distribution rather than just measures of central tendency. We have also been guilty of measuring what is easy to measure. We've been being led around typically by the nose in terms of what's gathered by StatsCan data, what's gathered by US Census, what's there in the county business patterns. And so we basically, I think, post hoc construct our notions of well-being to a certain degree based on the data available. And I'm hoping that we can move beyond that. Couple of other critiques that I want to engage. The second critique that I'm having some fun and rattling some cages with, we just got a piece this published a couple weeks ago actually in Ecological Economics, critiquing this idea of whether resource dependence is necessarily negative. Very negative in terms of the terms that are used. You often see it as synonymous with addiction, vulnerability, weakness, but there's this other class of synonyms like trust, confidence, belief, and faith that are tied to notions of depend and dependence as well. And so one of the things that we're starting to look at, depending on how you tweak not just the definition of dependence, but how you potentially tweak measures that emerge from that, whether this confidence or these other sorts of indicators of dependence can potentially foster more positive community outcomes. So there are two linked questions about this that I think need to be pulled apart, disaggregated. I think we conflate dependence as, typically when we measure dependence and sort of this classic work that I'm talking about, we use jobs, we use employment, we use income as a measure of dependence. Well, dependence is also a psychological state, right? And so we can think of, does this depend on whether we are using these behavioral measures or psychological measures? I think we also need to potentially engage the unit of analysis. Who depends? Do communities, do counties, which is actually our typical unit of analysis in this kind of work, do counties depend or do people depend? Do individuals depend? Do groups depend? So I think these are a couple of issues that need to be pulled apart a little bit better. So we need to examine these actions and psychologies at multiple scales. And I am not going to have time to go through this whole diagram. It's in the ecological economics piece if you care to travel that far. But basically trying to produce this typology of dependence where we see dependence as a psychological state versus a quasi-behavioral state, measured at the individual level or measured at the more community or aggregate level. And within each of these cells, it's possible to have positive outcomes and it's positive to have negative outcomes. And so I won't dwell on that, but a lot of the work that we're doing on basically is trying to say, how do we figure out what kind of cell is going to characterize certain situations? And how is that going to depend, for example, on characteristics of the resource itself? How is it going to depend on the type of indicator, the type of location, and the policy or governance influence under which it sits? Critique number 3 is this idea of, I think, almost sort of this knee-jerk reaction that rural development and community development has towards diversification. And we suggest in this piece, this is with some Canadian colleagues of mine, that this emphasis may be at least partially misguided. And so I want to spend what time I have left, I guess, on this, with this idea that we often counterpose diversity to dependence, and the idea being that if you are overly dependent on a single resource, your solution is to diversify. And whether you engage this as an academic, especially again, the rural development, community development boosters, you hear this language, hear this language all the time. So basically, we've borrowed this as social scientists straight out of ecology. So here's a concept that we've borrowed, and really borrowed quite uncritically, I think. And it's the uncritical borrowing that's led me to scratch my head and think about this stuff. So within ecology, there's this idea that if the system is more diverse, it's better able to respond to unspecified system shocks. So in other words, there's something bad that's going to happen sometime. We don't know what it is. We don't know what it's going to be like. We don't know when it's happening. But we need to basically not have all of our eggs in one basket so that we can respond to something that we don't know. So it's essentially a risk reduction strategy. There are a few issues that I want to engage with this. One about measurement, one about evidence, and one about translation. And I'll come back to each of these. Ecology doesn't know how to measure diversity yet, right? I mean, not really. There's plenty of discussion around issues like what level. I mean, we commonly think of biodiversity, we stampede to the species level. We can certainly drill deeper, and we can think about phenotypical or genetic diversity. We can go outwards, and we can think about interactional diversity and functional diversity in terms of the relationships that transcend species. We can think about what's the best geographic level within a given habitat, landscape level or regional level. We can also think about how it is that we actually do the counting when we think about one area being more diverse than another, in terms of, is it just plain old numbers of species? Is it relative abundance of species in terms of distribution? Or is it the presence or absence of a couple of species that we really care about, right? I mean, is a starling really worth the same as a grizzly bear when we're thinking about what it is that we care about in terms of diversity within ecology? So basically, I've been working on translating this to issues with economic diversity, subtitle Fun with Analogies. The idea being this richness, we can think of the total number of different economic sectors represented in a region. We can also think of evenness, and and I'll come back to critiquing these in a second. We can also think of diversity versus diversification. And what I would argue is that the empirical work that we have in regional economics, a lot of it looks at the effect, it compares more diverse with less diverse places. It doesn't necessarily look at the effect of policy interventions or diversification, right? Which, when we're talking about sort of these pushes, we don't care about comparing places that are in one state versus another. We care about doing something from a policy standpoint that may lead to different outcomes. Just to push the ecological analogy a little farther, here's where it gets fun. Within ecology, we certainly privilege rare species. We love them. We think we should save them. Does this necessarily make sense in the same way for quote-unquote endangered sectors, right? If we think about economic diversity, do we take more of a stance that, well, that's a sector that had its chance, it's run its course, we don't need it anymore, it's fine to quote-unquote let it go extinct? We also can think about this idea of exotic versus native species and sectors. Again, within ecology, we clearly privilege species that belong rather than those that have somehow been introduced through some nefarious act or have made their way across a body of water and have expanded their range and displaced things that we care about. And again, I think there's an analogy here for economic sectors. We usually tend to call things that are coming in new innovation, and we tend to like them a great deal. I think we need to ask some questions about boundaries and system openness. Clearly, habitats are not fixed and species move through. What's the proper scale in that sense to think about the distribution of social and economic diversity as well? And not quite lastly, but almost lastly, I think there are a few things that the economic diversity literature does not take on as well as the ecology definitions do. One is this idea of distance or functional differentiation. And so this idea of if you're looking at economic diversity and you do your calculations and you see X geography has Y number of sectors and this one has more than the other, and we say this one's more diverse, therefore it's going to be more resilient, it's going to suffer outside shocks better. What if it's a false diversity, right? What if all of those different sectors, even though they are categorized differently, what if they all have the same functional response to the same kind of shock, right? I mean, we can easily imagine compounding effects rather than offsetting effects, and we tend to not think about these functional relationships maybe quite as critically as we might. I think to sort of push the analogy a little bit, again, we can also think about hierarchies between species and specters really as almost quasi-trophic levels in ecology. You know, no ecologist worth his or her salt would say that they understand that there ought to be as many grizzly bears as mice, you know, in a given. It's just simply not the way the pyramid works. Have we thought this through for economic sectors in the same way that we have for ecology? Based on the stuff that I've read, I would say we haven't as well as we might. And I think we also tend to neglect regional differences in capacity to maintain diversity in terms of whether some systems can maintain as much diversity as others. One last thing, and then I'll wrap up because I see I'm cutting into my discussion time already. This idea too, I think, again, the difference between ecological systems and socioeconomic systems that gives us a real opportunity in this new resource play. When we think of ecosystems in terms of how's one system doing better, we have a very limited range of criteria that we can invoke, right? Is it persisting? Is it expanding, you know, relative to other kinds of systems? And we can certainly ask these same sort of criteria about human communities. We can ask about persistence and growth, but we have a bigger toolbox. We have a bigger toolbox that we can potentially engage rather than just are more diverse systems more likely to persist or not. We can also ask about subjective indicators, right? We can also ask questions about, are these better places to live by, and do people enjoy them more? Are they more eager to stay? Do people participate more fully? I lied, I had one more substantive slide. So this isn't all ideas. We've started some results analyzing national level StatsCan data, and we've found actually some very interesting things. So four empirical results I just want to share. First of all is there's a fairly weak relationship between economic diversity and resource dependence. So the idea that diversity is automatically the inverse of dependence is not borne out by the data. Second, there is this small diversity effect on issues like income and poverty. So more diverse communities tend to have better outcomes. As I alluded to earlier before, there's no effect of diversification. We see no effect of change in economic diversity between time 1 and time 2 in terms of these outcomes. And sort of the real kibosh on the thing is basically this whole thing goes away if we control for population size. So if you are looking at places that are of similar size, the additional benefits of diversity vanish. So this is just my conclusion slide. I think I will just leave it up so you can read it, and I will thank you very much.